Palestine is talked about all the time, but do you really know its history? A sad reality. We've reportedly reached 45,600 deaths in Gaza. I declare that France recognizes the state of Palestine today. Palestine is at the heart of one of the most complex conflicts of the 20th and 21st centuries. And to understand why, I suggest we dive together into more than 2,000 years of history in the Middle East. Today, I'm tackling a big subject, because I'd like to tell you the history of Palestine. But before we start, you know how it goes. This video exists thanks to the support of Odoo. Odoo has been with me for a while now on my projects, especially the ones that require a lot of research and a lot of people working on them, like this one. Odoo, if you don't know it, is business management software for companies, entrepreneurs, or anyone who wants to manage their activity from a single platform, from project management to invoicing, accounting, and website creation. Today I'm going to talk about a really handy app, the Signature app. This app, as the name suggests, lets you sign, get signatures, and track your documents online in just a few clicks. It's super simple. You designate one or more signatories, then add fields by dragging them onto the document to request a name, date, signature, making them mandatory or not. And before sending, you can even set the order of signatures. Vlad, my agent, is thrilled because he's always chasing me down for documents I haven't signed. But thanks to, or because of, Odoo, I have no more excuses. You can set up automatic reminders for late signers like me and track progress in real time. Signed, pending, or refused. Odoo gives you your first app with unlimited hosting and support. You can add more as your business and needs grow. And starting from just €19.90 per month, you get access to all the apps. Feel free to check it out using my link in the description. By using that link, you help support the channel. Before getting into the thick of it, I have to admit something. I hesitated a lot before making this video. Palestine is an extremely complex territory and its history spans several millennia. Obviously, I won't be able to be 100% exhaustive, but as usual, everything I talk about is sourced and color-coded in a document you can find in the description. Okay, let's start with the basics. Concretely, what is Palestine? As of when I'm filming this video, according to international law, it's this territory, a land located in the Middle East, with the Mediterranean to the west, Jordan to the east, Lebanon to the north, and Egypt to the south. It's an area divided into two blocks, the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, which includes the eastern part of the city of Jerusalem. And this area has been under Israeli occupation since 1967. When I say Israeli occupation, that's not my personal political opinion. It's simply what international law states. The United Nations, which you may know as the organization that brings together all the world's countries, officially refers to it as Occupied Palestinian Territory. And to understand how it became occupied, we need to go back a bit in time. I'll skip the details of prehistory to keep this video reasonably short, and I suggest we go straight to what was happening in the second millennium BC. I don't think I've ever gone this far back in time in a video. At that time, Palestine was a land called Canaan. It was inhabited by a collection of pagan peoples and tribes who believed in multiple deities. Around the 12th century BC, two new groups came to settle there. The Israelites, who are actually the ancestors of the Jewish people, and the Philistines, who established themselves along the Mediterranean coast, right here. It's this tribe that would give its name to Palestine, even though the term wouldn't be used until much later. All these groups coexisted, and in the 10th century BC, the Israelite tribes organized themselves to form the Kingdom of Israel. According to the Torah, the sacred text for Jews, it was the second king of Israel, David, who made Jerusalem his capital. And in 957 BC, his son Solomon had what we call the first temple of Jerusalem built. Now, you might be wondering why I'm telling you all this. Since when is he doing theology? Well, because while working on this video, I came to understand that Jerusalem is a key point in the broader history of Palestine. What you really need to understand is that Jerusalem is an extremely symbolic city for the three great monotheistic religions in the world: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. For Jews, this first temple that Solomon built in Jerusalem is the place that houses the Spirit of God. It's the cultural and political center of the Jewish people. In the first book of the Torah, it's even written, "I will give to you and to your descendants after you the land where you are now living as a foreigner, all the land of Canaan, as a permanent possession. And I will be their God." Essentially, God promises the land of Canaan, that is, Palestine, to the Jewish people. That's why in the Jewish tradition, it's referred to as the Promised Land. But peace in the region wouldn't last long. To make things even more complicated, in the years 30 AD, Jerusalem became the holy city of a new religion, Christianity. That's where Jesus was crucified and, according to the Gospels, where he also rose from the dead. His tomb is in Jerusalem, so the city became sacred to Christians as well. And it doesn't stop there. In 610 AD, a new religion appeared in what is now Saudi Arabia. A merchant caravaner named Muhammad said he received divine revelations. By spreading his message, Muhammad gave birth to Islam. In the Quran, the holy book for Muslims, it is said that around the year 620, Muhammad ascended to heaven from a rock. And where is that rock? Bingo! It's also in Jerusalem. Today it stands beneath this monument, which is the third holiest site in Islam. Jews, Christians, Muslims. Jerusalem thus became a triply holy land. When Muhammad died in 632, his successors, the caliphs Abu Bakr, Omar, Uthman, and Ali, embarked on a great territorial expansion. They waged several battles and gradually acquired significant territory. By 640, they controlled all of Palestine. After that, hold tight, Palestine became part of the Umayyad Caliphate, the Abbasid Caliphate, the Fatimid Caliphate, then the Seljuk Empire, the Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem, the Ayyubid dynasty, the Mamluk Sultanate, and finally the Ottoman Empire. Now, the Ottoman Empire, for those who, like me, may have dozed off a bit in history class, was a gigantic territory stretching from Eastern Europe to the Middle East and North Africa, bringing together Turks, Arabs, Greeks, Armenians, Kurds, Slavs, Jews. In short, the Ottoman Empire was a mosaic of peoples, predominantly Arab and Muslim, but also including Christians and Jews. And that's important to keep in mind, because this diverse population lived together in Palestine for all those centuries. Depending on the era, there were more or less harmonious episodes, but overall things went fairly well, until we reached the 20th century. Because from that point on, as you'll see, the ambitions and strategies of the great powers would intertwine with the birth of a new ideology that would shatter the calm of Palestine. We're now in 1896, in Vienna, Austria. A certain Theodor Herzl, an Austro-Hungarian journalist, publishes The Jewish State. This book would change everything for Palestine, as it's the founding text of Zionism. For those who don't know yet, Zionism is an ideology based on the conviction that the Jewish people must have a territory of their own. You have to understand that at the time Herzl published this book, at the end of the 19th century, the context was particularly hostile toward Jews in Europe. Anti-Semitism, hatred of Jews, was spreading. Jews were regarded by part of the population as, I quote, an undesirable race, and were targeted in often deadly attacks. Beyond that, a nationalist sentiment had taken hold across all of Europe. So Theodor Herzl told himself two things. 1. Jews are a people, and 2. If they want to live safely, they must have an independent state. To bring his vision to life, Theodor Herzl organized the first Zionist Congress in Basel, Switzerland in August 1897. Nearly 250 Jewish delegates from around the world gathered to discuss how to organize the Zionist ideology. The World Zionist Organization was born there. Now you might be thinking, okay, but what does this have to do with Palestine? Well, at the end of that Congress, the participants adopted the Basel Program, which stated notably this: Zionism aims to create for the Jewish people a home in Palestine secured under public law. And unsurprisingly, from that point on, things started to get complicated. The mayor of Jerusalem at the time, a certain Yusuf Dia al-Khalidi, sensed things heating up. Here is what he wrote to Theodor Herzl in 1899. The idea itself is only natural, beautiful, and just. Who can contest the rights of the Jews to Palestine? But unfortunately, the destinies of nations are not governed only by such abstract conceptions. however pure and noble they may be. Now, the reality is that Palestine forms an integral part of the Ottoman Empire and, what is more serious, it is inhabited by others than Israelites. This mayor of Jerusalem was pointing out the key problem. The territory where Jews were coming to settle was already occupied by others. To give you an idea, in Palestine before 1882, there were around 400,000 Muslims, 43,000 Christians, and only 15,000 Jews, less than 5% of the total population. But between 1882 and 1903, around 25,000 Jews emigrated to Palestine to flee the rising anti-Semitism in Europe. Little by little, these Jewish immigrants were assisted by the World Zionist Organization, which bought land in Palestine and negotiated with international powers to gain political support for its project. Between 1904 and 1914, a second wave of immigration brought 35,000 to 40,000 more Jews. So while Jews represented less than 5% of the population in Palestine in 1880, by 1914 they represented 8%. The landscape of this territory was gradually changing before the eyes of completely powerless Palestinians. And in this context of rising tension, a conflict was about to create absolute chaos. In 1918, the Ottoman Empire, which was still managing Palestine, came out as a loser from World War I. The victors rushed to carve up the spoils, and to formalize the distribution of territories. The League of Nations, the predecessor to the United Nations, established a mandate system. Essentially, the League of Nations told the inhabitants of these territories, "You're not capable of governing yourselves, so we'll help you achieve independence by placing you under the tutelage of a great power." And so it was the British Empire that received the mandate over Palestine in 1922. Except, well, they quickly ran into a problem. During the war, the British had promised the Arabs they would recognize the independence of an Arab kingdom in exchange for their support in the fight against the Ottomans. Yet 1 year before the end of the war, the British government had adopted the declaration of Foreign Secretary Arthur James Balfour, which stated, "His Majesty's government views with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object." So on one hand, the British had promised the Arabs to support the creation of an independent kingdom. And on the other, they had also promised Jews the establishment of a national Jewish home in Palestine. For Palestinians, this was a true stab in the back. And the most astonishing thing is that at the time of the Balfour Declaration, the British had no authority over Palestine whatsoever. It was only 1917, and the British mandate didn't begin until 1922. In fact, the British did this mainly out of self-interest. They wanted to secure their dominance over Palestine, a crucial zone on the route to India, a territory that at the time was within their sphere of influence. And some British leaders were simply convinced by the arguments of the pro-Zionist movement. So, thousands of enthusiastic Jews emigrated to Palestine, began buying land there, and the cohabitation was explosive. On the ground, the Zionist project collided with Arab nationalist aspirations. On April 4, 1920, riots in the Old City of Jerusalem left 9 dead, 5 Jews and 4 Arabs, and several hundred injured. In August 1929, 249 people were killed, and the situation was not going to improve, because 4,000 kilometers away, one figure was about to permanently change the course of Palestine's history. In 1933, Adolf Hitler came to power in Germany and developed his Nazi, anti-Semitic policies. For the dictator, Jews were, I quote, subhumans. Many Jews decided to flee Germany to escape persecution, and tens of thousands of new Jewish immigrants arrived in Palestine each year. To give you an idea, in 1931, Jews made up about 17% of the Palestinian population. 4 years later, they were 30%. Little by little, the beginnings of a state took shape, with Jewish political, administrative, and security institutions. And above all, the purchase of Palestinian land by Jews accelerated. On the other side, Palestinian nationalist sentiment was growing, and the idea of a national Arab struggle against the British and the immigrationists kept gaining ground. In 1936, thousands of Arabs rose up in Palestine. This became known as the Great Revolt. A year later, the British launched an inquiry commission, the Peel Commission, to understand what was happening. And big surprise, it concluded, 1. The Arabs want independence. 2. They fear a Jewish homeland in Palestine. And 3. The promises made to both sides are simply incompatible. The authors of the report suggested dividing Palestine, which only fueled Arab anger further. The Great Revolt then became a full-blown insurgency. To calm things down, the British announced in 1939 a new policy limiting Jewish immigration to Palestine to 75,000 people over 5 years. This policy, called the White Paper, also restricted land purchases by Jewish organizations and promised Palestinian independence within 10 years, meaning around 1949. On paper, for Palestinians, this White Paper was a reasonable compromise. But once again, a war was about to upend all those promises. On September 1, 1939, at 5:15 in the morning, without a declaration of war, Hitler launched the Wehrmacht against Poland. World War II had begun. The Second World War changed the entire equation. 6 million Jews were victims of the genocide perpetrated by Nazi Germany, what we call the Shoah. The survivors often had nowhere to go. Many Jews wanted to flee Europe and take refuge in Palestine. The British were overwhelmed. Morally, they couldn't send the survivors of the Shoah back to Europe after the horrors they had endured. And at the same time, they faced the anger of Arabs who saw more and more Jews arriving in Palestine. In 1947, the British Foreign Secretary Ernest Bevin clarified his country's position. His Majesty's government is not in a position to continue indefinitely to govern Palestine themselves simply because Arabs and Jews cannot agree on the form of self-government to be established. So concretely, the British disengaged and decided to leave the Palestinian question in the hands of the United Nations. Right. After having thoroughly complicated the situation, they said, "Okay guys, figure it out, we don't have a solution." The thing is, this Palestinian question was already nearly unsolvable. 2 peoples for 1 land. The equation was doomed from the start and would lead to a full-scale regional war. But before continuing the story, this is where I invite you to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. We did an enormous amount of research work for this video. Your support means a lot, and frankly, it's the best way to give strength to my work and that of my team. Once again, the fate of Palestine was being written outside its borders. On November 29, 1947, the UN decided on the partition of Palestine between Arabs and Jews. Concretely, the UN proposed to its General Assembly a plan dividing Palestinian territory into 3 zones: a Jewish state, an Arab state, and the city of Jerusalem with a special international status. But this proposal quickly fell apart. For the Arabs, the territorial split was completely unjust. About 55% of Palestine would go to the Jews, even though they represented barely 30% of the population at the time. The day after the UN vote, a civil war broke out between the Jewish and Arab communities. Bombings, ambushes, riots, attacks on villages. The fighting lasted until May 1948 and resulted in between 1,700 and 1,800 deaths on the Jewish side. On the Palestinian side, it was 2 to 3 times more. On May 14th of that year, the British mandate officially ended, and that very same day, the Zionist leaders announced. The man you just heard is David Ben-Gurion, a Zionist politician who declared the independence of this new country without specifying its borders. And his announcement, as you can imagine, went over very, very badly in the Arab world. So on May 15, 1948, Egypt, Transjordan, Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon went to war against the State of Israel in support of the Palestinians. This was the beginning of the First Arab-Israeli War. Once again, the pitiful spectacles of war played out on this land, which had nonetheless been the center of humanity's great hope. And the world searched in vain for a reasonable solution to the Palestinian problem. After 10 months of conflict, Israel emerged victorious and took control of 78% of Palestinian territory. To make it very concrete so you can really see what that means, this is the border proposed by the UN in 1947. And this is the new border after the First Arab-Israeli War. Jordan took control of the West Bank and Egypt managed the Gaza Strip. Arab local populations were expelled or massacred, and hundreds of villages were destroyed. As a result, just over 80% of Palestinians were forced into exile. At the time of the armistice, more than 500,000 people, with little more than the clothes on their backs, took refuge in neighboring Arab countries. That excerpt dates from 1967, but today historians estimate that it was actually closer to 750,000 Palestinians who had to leave their land in 1948. This episode is what Arabs call the Nakba, meaning catastrophe in Arabic. And less than 20 years later, the borders of the Arab state envisioned by the UN would shrink even further. On June 5 at dawn, Israeli planes struck military targets in Egypt, Syria, and Jordan. In 1967, the Second Arab-Israeli War broke out, also nicknamed the Six-Day War. In less than a week, Israel took control of all Palestinian territories and seized the Golan Heights from Syria and the Sinai Peninsula from Egypt. In fact, one reason Israel won all its battles one after another is that its armed forces were better prepared. The Israeli army was structured, with centralized command and more advanced technological capabilities, many of which had been supplied by France a few years earlier. On the other side, the Arab armies were less experienced and had older equipment. For Palestinians, this war was a new trauma, what they call the Naksa, meaning relapse in Arabic. Nearly 300,000 more Palestinians embarked on the road to exile, mainly to Jordan. A few months later, November 22, 1967, the United Nations passed a resolution defining these territories as occupied. In the case of Palestine, that refers to the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, which includes East Jerusalem. The UN also demanded the withdrawal of Israeli troops. But that didn't stop Israeli Jews from settling in the West Bank, Gaza, and around East Jerusalem, building settlements that were protected by the Israeli army, which imposed checkpoints and controls on Palestinians. As a result, in the 1970s, the Palestinian struggle grew in strength. At the time, it was led by the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization. And in 1969, a certain Yasser Arafat took its helm, with a clear objective, to end the Israeli occupation and create a Palestinian state. What he had in mind was a secular state that would take the shape of the British Mandate, that is, what it looked like before the UN Partition Plan and the creation of Israel. Since Palestine was occupied, the PLO set up its bases a few dozen kilometers from the Israeli border in Jordan. From there, it organized ambushes, raids, and sabotage operations. Israel retaliated, and King Hussein of Jordan began to look unfavorably upon these fighters who were undermining his authority and worsening tensions with Israel. In September 1970, the Jordanian army bombed the refugee camps and buildings housing Arafat and his men, forcing them to flee. Following this event, which would be called Black September, the PLO relocated to Lebanon. But things didn't improve. On October 6, 1973, a new thunderclap shook the region. Tel Aviv and Cairo agreed to acknowledge that fierce fighting was at that moment pitting their air forces and tanks against each other, with very heavy losses in men and equipment. While Jews were celebrating the religious holiday of Yom Kippur, they were caught off guard by a coordinated attack by Egypt and Syria, who wanted to reclaim their territory lost during the Six-Day War. This was the beginning of another Arab-Israeli war, one that would once again be very short and very deadly, with more than 20,000 deaths. In 19 days, Israel secured another victory, allowing it to retain the Sinai territories and the Golan Heights. In the years that followed, more and more Israeli settlements were built on Palestinian territory. To give you a very concrete idea, between 1967 and 1977, an average of 770 settlers arrived each year in the occupied territories. In the following decade, that number was 7 times higher. So inevitably, in 1987, history repeated itself. Abroad, in Israel, once again violent clashes in the occupied territories. 49 Palestinians killed or wounded that day by the Israeli army, according to a PLO spokesperson. That year marked the beginning of what would be called the First Intifada. Intifada in Arabic means uprising. And this Intifada started in Gaza before spreading to the entire West Bank. Looking more closely at this period, I came to understand that what distinguishes this revolt from previous conflicts is that this time it was Palestinian youth who launched it. This generation had known nothing but Israeli occupation, checkpoints, searches, curfews, humiliation at the hands of Israeli soldiers. They were frustrated, and by the late 1980s, they had reached their breaking point. The Intifada made a lot of noise internationally, and images of young Palestinians throwing stones at Israeli tanks went around the world. But beyond the 1987 Intifada, this was also the year of the creation of a Palestinian Islamist and nationalist movement you've certainly heard of. Originally, Hamas was a branch of the Muslim Brotherhood, an Islamist organization created in Egypt in the 1920s. Hamas is a radical movement. They want armed struggle against Israel and the establishment of an Islamic Palestinian state. In 1988, they established a charter containing clearly anti-Semitic passages and calling for the destruction of the Zionist invasion. For Hamas, jihad, holy war against Israel, is a religious duty. And while from our Western perspective we see Hamas as a violent and terrorist movement in Palestine at the end of the 1980s, it had a very different image. Hamas opened schools, clinics, and mosques, and became quite popular among a portion of the Palestinian population. Unlike Hamas, the PLO redefined its strategy and ultimately chose the path of diplomacy. In 1988, Yasser Arafat, the leader of the PLO, took a historic step to move the situation forward. The PLO implicitly recognized Israel, which had not previously been the case. As a result, an official diplomatic dialogue opened between Palestine and the United States. All that was missing was Israel at the table. At first, Israel refused to participate. But the rise to power in 1992 of a left-wing politician, a certain Yitzhak Rabin, changed the equation. Unlike his predecessor, he was in favor of a peace agreement with Palestine. The two sides talked, negotiations lasted 8 months, and in 1993, in Washington, we witnessed this. That handshake took place in Washington, in front of the White House, and it was enormously symbolic. Let's pause for a second to analyze this image. On the right, we see Yasser Arafat, the leader of the Palestine Liberation Organization, shaking hands with Yitzhak Rabin, the Israeli Prime Minister, on the left. Here in the center, Bill Clinton, the American president at the time, appears as the one reconciling the two sides. The negotiations between the three men resulted in what became known as the Oslo Accords, agreements that provided for the mutual recognition of the legitimate and political rights of Israel and Palestine, the establishment of an interim autonomous Palestinian authority with the creation of a parliament, and the withdrawal of Israeli troops from the Gaza Strip and the Jericho region of the West Bank. Concretely, certain areas of territory occupied by Israel passed under Palestinian civil administration, and the Israeli army was no longer supposed to enter them. The signing of the accords also put an end to the Intifada that had begun 4 years earlier. The toll was heavy. 1,124 Palestinians and 27 Israelis had died. After that, the handshake between Rabin and Arafat sparked unprecedented hope. A wave of optimism swept across the entire world. Palestine and Israel might finally reach an understanding and coexist. But then came an assassination that would derail everything. Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin has been assassinated tonight in Tel Aviv. Yitzhak Rabin was about to leave a major rally in support of the peace process when he was struck by 3 bullets fired from an automatic weapon. The shooter was immediately arrested, a 23-year-old Israeli who reportedly belonged to a far-right group. On November 4, 1995, the death of Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin shattered the fragile peace process between Israel and Palestine. The Jewish state took a sharp turn to the right. In 1996, a certain Benjamin Netanyahu, a member of the right-wing Likud party, came to power. The Clinton administration tried to salvage the peace process, but without success. And in September 2000, the region once again erupted. It all started with one man. Ariel Sharon, a right-wing Israeli nationalist and hardliner toward Palestinians, visited the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, which houses the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Dome of the Rock. I mentioned it at the very beginning of the video. It's the third holiest site for Muslims. In a context of already high tensions, with Jerusalem at the heart of the conflict, Sharon wanted to assert Israeli sovereignty over the site, and for Palestinians, it was the spark. Clashes took place here in East Jerusalem, north of Ramallah. Young Palestinians threw stones at soldiers, who responded by firing rubber bullets. In late September 2000, the Second Intifada began. It would last approximately 5 years and result in 3,000 Palestinian deaths and 1,000 Israeli deaths. In March 2002, a suicide bombing carried out by Hamas killed 30 people, including the attacker, in Netanya, 30 kilometers north of Tel Aviv. The Israeli army then launched an operation to retake full control of the West Bank and certain areas of Gaza. And the government of Ariel Sharon, who had by then been elected Israeli prime minister, decided to build this, a separation wall between the occupied West Bank and Israel, which he presented as a security barrier. In practice, the wall encroached significantly on West Bank territory, allowing Israel to bring additional land to its side. In 2004, Human Rights Watch found that the barrier confined more than 100,000 men, women, and children to enclaves. A year later, Ariel Sharon made a concession and ordered the complete withdrawal from the Gaza Strip. 8,000 Israeli settlers and Israeli army troops had to pack up and leave, but in the years that followed, a land and sea blockade was imposed on Gaza, where life became a living hell. Poverty was pervasive. In 2022, nearly half of Gaza's population was unemployed, and 62% of Gazans required food assistance. Since Hamas seized power in the Gaza Strip in 2007, cycles of violence with Israel have multiplied, and 4 major military operations have been conducted by Israel against Hamas in Gaza: Operation Cast Lead, Operation Pillar of Defense, Operation Protective Edge, and a final operation in response to this. Palestinian commandos infiltrating several points of Israeli territory, and scenes of horror too unbearable to watch. Hamas launched an unprecedented attack this morning. The Palestinian movement also fired hundreds of rockets from the Gaza Strip. The attack took the Israeli population by surprise as they were celebrating a festive weekend. There are already nearly 100 dead and 900 wounded. On October 7, 2023, Hamas launched an unprecedented surprise attack, named Operation Al-Aqsa Flood, on Israeli territory. Around 1,200 Israelis were killed. It was the bloodiest day in the history of the Jewish state. The terrorist group also kidnapped 251 civilians, soldiers, and police officers. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu used very strong words. And as of the time I'm filming this video, experts estimate that more than 100,000 Palestinians have been killed, with 80% of them being civilians, and 1.9 million Gazans have been displaced within the Gaza Strip. More than 500,000 Palestinians are suffering from famine, and the Gaza Strip is nothing but a field of ruins. Over 90% of homes in Gaza have been damaged or destroyed. It's in this context that in September 2025, before the United Nations, France, accompanied by around 10 other Western countries, decided this: I declare that France recognizes the state of Palestine today. In reality, France simply followed the 148 out of 193 UN member states that already recognized Palestine. But the idea behind all of this is to restart the diplomatic process and the famous two-state solution, the one that would consist of creating a Jewish state and an Arab state in Palestine. But despite these symbolic gestures, on the ground the situation is worsening. In the West Bank, where approximately 3 million Palestinians and 700,000 Israeli settlers live today, violence is surging. In October 2025, the UN Human Rights Office recorded 260 attacks by Israeli settlers against Palestinians in that region, the highest number ever recorded since 2006. On the Israeli side, politics continue to radicalize. Benjamin Netanyahu's government is today partly composed of far-right extremists. That's the case with these two men, Bezalel Smotrich, the finance minister, and Itamar Ben-Gvir, the national security minister, who advocates for the total annexation of Palestine. The former co-founded an NGO aimed at expanding Israeli settlements in Palestine, and the latter has been convicted multiple times for incitement to racism and for supporting Catch, a religious nationalist movement listed as a terrorist organization in both Israel and the United States. In short, today, even as the conflict continues, many observers and specialists, including Israeli ones, agree that a genocide is being committed by Israel in Palestine. And the more time passes, the harder it becomes to imagine the two-state solution. The history of Palestine is the history of a disputed, fragmented, divided land. It's the history of a double promise that triggered one of the most violent conflicts of the century. The history of populations displaced, persecuted, killed. But the history of Palestine is also the story of a hope for peace, for coexistence, the story of thousands of refugees who simply dream of returning home. Friends, thank you for watching this video. This was a video that was very important to me. Don't forget to subscribe to support my work and that of my team. The subject is incredibly complex, which is why we received the help of Vincent Lemire, a historian who also wrote this great graphic novel I recommend on the subject. Thank you to him for his invaluable proofreading as well. Talking about the history of Palestine from my little studio was interesting, but I wanted to take my research further. So a few weeks ago, I decided to travel to the West Bank to film a report there, and to try to meet young Palestinians and Israelis to understand what it means to be 25 in the West Bank today. We're working on that. It's coming soon to my YouTube channel. Also note that from now on you can find my videos in podcast form on all listening platforms. Just search Gaspard. And day to day, I also look forward to seeing you on Instagram. And if you enjoyed this video, I recommend these 2 other videos on my channel, including this one where I talk about the rise to power of the American tech giants. Bye.